Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Nos programmes en langue française commencent maintenant. J'ai le plaisir de vous tenir compagnie jusqu'à 20h, heure locale du Caire. Tout de suite, un journal complet vous est présenté par Yara Choucha et moi-même, Ashraf Massoud. Bonsoir Yara.
Bonsoir Ashraf, bonsoir mesdames et messieurs. Et voici les principaux titres. Au 19e jour de l'intervention militaire russe en Ukraine, les combats ne cessent de s'étendre alors qu'un nouveau tour de pourparlers russo-ukrainien suscite une lueur d'espoir.
Filmmaking, and that's on open access, that information. Secondly, Irpin is fully controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian units. So given what the colleagues are saying who survived that, it was them who opened fire on their vehicles. Mr. President, we were under no illusion. We knew that today's meeting would in no way be on cooperation between the UN and the OSCE. The demand for cooperation over recent years has sharply decreased due to attempts by a certain club of states to replace the UN Charter by a rules-based order. The OSCE has become a glaring example of this. This has become particularly noticeable recently when the work of the organization, which even before this paid disproportionate attention to countries to the east of Vienna, de facto boiled down to just one subject. The discussions on this, as far as we can gather, are not so much unprofessional, but in fact hysterical in tone, and unacceptable tone has been used. When Mr. Rao, on the 15th of February, visited Moscow, we had substantive talks with him. Back then, he talked about the importance of a proactive, positive approach and the quest for solutions and the rejection of mutual accusations. We supported such an approach. We expressed our conviction that the chairmanship should facilitate the formation of a unifying agenda and achieve compromises. For this, it's important to remain within the mandate of the chairmanship and to stick to the status-neutral approaches, as they say, and to avoid non-consensus-based wordings, which, in other words, is called embracing the role of an honest broker. However, today we can note that the Polish chairmanship of the OSCE has almost failed in its mission. We're only in the middle of March, though. On the 5th of March, following the talks with the US Secretary of State, Mr. Rao said essentially that the chairpersonship of the OSCE would coordinate the actions against one participating state of the organization. This is an egregious violation by Poland of the mandate of the OSCE chairperson in office adopted at the 2002 Porto Ministerial Council, and also the decisions of the Permanent Council of the OSCE number 485 on public statements. The point of the work of the chairperson in office is precisely to solve disagreements between participating states and to bring positions closer. It is in no way to take biased steps which further inflame confrontation, and especially not to head up an anti-Russian campaign in the OSCE. Today, Mr. Rao and also a number of colleagues stated that Russia apparently has proposed discussing their concerns on security in the OSCE, but it refused. That's not true. We did not refute the Polish chairpersonship proposed dialogue. However, we underscore that for it to be successful, we would need to get responses from the US and individual members of the OSCE as to how they perceive in practice the implementation of the principle, the indivisibility of security. Since we just got some notes, and not from countries, but from the EU and NATO, that we didn't pay attention to properly, that were not taken seriously, or rather, we just got notes, but it wasn't from countries, but it was from the EU and NATO. And we did not contact them regarding these matters. Stating that in the OSCE some kind of helpful dialogue has been started is absolute nonsense. It is the fault of our Western colleagues that the OSCE has not yet been able to deal with important pivotal challenges, achieving a single fundamental understanding of the European security architecture and the indivisibility of that very security. This principle requires avoiding any actions that would strengthen somebody's security to the detriment of the security of any other country. All this is enshrined in many OSCE documents, starting with 1994, when the Code of Conduct for Military Political Sphere was adopted. Then at the highest level, the European Security Charter of Istanbul was adopted in 1999. In December 2010, at the OSCE summit in Astana, this principle was, in an expanded form, unambiguously confirmed. However, the Western camp made a top priority out of the right of any country to choose its alliance. Regarding the fact that this cannot be done to the detriment of other people's security is something that our colleagues preferred to forget. Today, Mr. Rao said that Russia is requiring unilateral agreements for itself, or guarantees for itself. The detonator for this serious crisis in European security occurring due to the trends I mentioned was the situation in Ukraine. I believe that here as well, the OSCE is directly to blame, and the Polish chairmanship, who prevented it inter alia through the special representative in the contact group, and the Polish chairmanship is directly to blame too, who prevented it inter alia through the special representative of the contact group to get the Ukrainian side to fully and consistently implement the Minsk package of measures. The scheme of actions was crystal clear, first and foremost to ensure direct dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk and Lugansk, and also to ensure unbiased observance of the situation by the special monitoring mission of the OSCE forces. Its leadership was required to engage in constructive cooperation with the authorities of Donetsk and Lugansk, as stipulated in the mandate of this mission approved by the Permanent Council of the OSCE. In line with this mandate, the mission should not have ignored the violations of human rights and mass media freedom breaches throughout the entire Ukrainian territory, nor failed to notice the blatant facts that attested to the unfurling of aggressive nationalism, neo-Nazism, and the numerous cases of discrimination against the Russian-speaking population. Furthermore, there were gross violations of human rights in Ukraine. Discrimination laws about state language and education and indigenous peoples were adopted, primarily targeted against the Russian language and the millions of Russian-speaking population. Instead of this, we saw that the OSCE blatantly played with the Ukrainian authorities, and they categorically rejected the key provision of Minsk, a direct dialogue with Donbass, preferring to talk to their fellow countrymen living there in the language of guns and shelling. By flagrantly sabotaging its own obligations, Kiev did everything it could to destroy the Minsk agreements. Russia has consistently urged Ukraine to respect the wishes of the inhabitants of Donbass and their legitimate desire to speak in their own language and to teach their children in it, and to honor those who freed these lands from the fascists and not those who fought on the side of Hitler's people and who killed civilians during the Second World War. But Kiev did not want to hear us. At the same time, the West, headed up by the US, instead of forcing Ukraine to implement its obligations under the Minsk agreements, did everything to goad it, ignoring the sabotage of Minsk. Furthermore, NATO countries pumped Ukraine full of modern weapons and sent military instructors, and in every way helped the militarization of the region. The actions of its Western backers were perceived by Kiev as a carte blanche to conduct military provocations in Donbass. At the end of January, February, the refusal to implement Minsk was stated loud and clear by almost all the senior leadership of Ukraine. And Mr. Kyslytsya confirmed this during the Security Council meeting on the 17th of February. After this, there was a sharp worsening of the situation along the entire contact line. Numerous ceasefire violations were recorded and civilians' homes were shelled, as were schools and other civilian facilities. Unfortunately, this did cause victims. There was a significant increase in the threat of the recurrence of full-scale hostilities like in 2014-2015. The population of the republics encountered the real threat of direct destruction by the Kiev authorities. a wave of refugees poured into our country. As we found out later from documents recovered from Ukrainian soldiers during our military operation, they were given an order to start military actions against LPR and DPR back in March. A copy of these documents are available on the Russian Ministry of Defense site. Our operation hampered these plans. Against Russia, there is now a large-scale information war, and the facilities in the DPR and LPR are shamelessly being portrayed by Western media as the result of our military operation in Ukraine. They are banding about false reports about apparent indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian towns and cities without any justification whatsoever. There is censorship of the information space, total censorship. In these conditions, receiving objective information about our military operation and also distinguishing blatant fakes of the alleged shelling by Russia of the Mariupol Maternity Hospital is something that's very difficult for people in Western countries to obtain. Therefore, the untruths bandied about from the Security Council is something we view as a deliberate provocation by our Western colleagues. Currently, the main threat to the civilians in Ukraine is posed by the Ukrainian nationalist armed formations. They have unleashed real terror against their compatriots. There are mass violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Nationalists place tanks, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers directly beside and in kindergartens and schools. They equip firing positions in the roofs of people's homes, and they're hiding behind women and children. Russian soldiers taken prisoner are subject to sadistic torture. Ukrainian bandits video the torture, and the Kiev regime flaunt this brutality. A large number of criminals have been released from prison. A criminal decision was taken by the Kiev regime to distribute tens of thousands of firearms to God knows who. In Kiev alone, this is 10,000. In towns and cities of Ukraine, there's rampaging armed bands of looters and robbers. The bandits are firing at ordinary citizens. We've also recorded broad-scale use by the Kiev regime of phosphorus-filled ammunition. This is counter to the third protocol of the UN Convention dated 1980. And cluster bombs are being used and are being by the Ukrainian army, as I said, and for some reason this is not attracting any attention whatsoever. In these circumstances, the OSCE-CIO, as part of one of its priorities, is to help civilians affected by conflicts. It needs, therefore, to swiftly provide political assistance to the safe evacuation of civilians from the regions of hostilities, to whichever side the Ukrainians themselves want to go to. Russian forces each day unilaterally are opening corridors to evacuate people. However, it's not everybody who can use these corridors. Kiev is not ashamed to threaten its own citizens who are trying to leave towns and cities. Sir, on the 11th of March, we raised in the Security Council the issue of the US biolaboratories in the Ukraine. I'm not going to repeat ourselves, but once again, I'd like to warn about the danger of biomaterials with dangerous strains falling into the hands of Ukrainian radicals. As we've seen, they've proven able to carry out the most horrific provocations against civilians in Ukrainian towns and cities. We're also receiving reports about possible sabotage of gas pipeline systems in Ukraine. Furthermore, according to the information of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, Ukrainian armed formations are actively preparing for active provocations with the use of chemical substances in order to accuse Russia of purportedly using chemical weapons. So on the night of the 9th of March, the Ukrainian nationalists transported to Zolchev, to the northwest of Kharkov, about 80 tons of ammonia. On the 10th of March, the Ukrainian media started to disseminate information about how to protect yourself from a chemical attack. The way in which the thinking is going is no longer in any doubt, especially because our American colleagues, as we repeatedly heard from the lips of the PR of the US in the Security Council, has already given a clue as to who they intend to place the blame on for the dangerous turn of events. If this, God forbid, provocation actually takes place, don't say we didn't warn you. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to urge the chairperson in office to prevent the destruction of the OSCE. It's important not to forget that within it, a number of other topics are discussed which require members of the organization to pay particular attention to, in particular as regards the peaceful and comprehensive settlement of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. A key role there is played by the OSCE Minsk Group. In current circumstances, the OSCE is really the only forum where European-wide dialogue is possible. There's a need to have a think about the historic impact of your action seeking to undermine any prospects for cooperation in the interests of security of all countries in Europe. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. At the outset, I would like to thank His Excellency Zbigniew Rau, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland and Chairman in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe for 2022, and Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for their comprehensive briefings. The UAE supports the role of regional organizations in finding solutions to conflicts, as these organizations have a comprehensive understanding of regional situations and positions. They're also capable of finding common ground to establish regional peace and security. Participating states of regional organizations are usually among the first to be affected by the security, economic, and humanitarian dimensions of the region's crises. As such, reflecting their concerns contributes to reaching comprehensive and realistic solutions. UN Security Council Resolution 6